He's never been a child. I was halfway through my shift when the call came in. It was from one of our regulars, an elderly woman named Mary who lived alone in an old, decaying house at the edge of our small town of Millwater. Mary was in her late 80s, and she'd been calling us for years. The officers all knew her well. She had a habit of reporting children in her home, claiming they were sneaking in and moving her belongings. Each time we'd respond, check the house, and find nothing. She was never aggressive or combative, just confused. We suspected dementia, but it wasn't our job to diagnose, only to make sure she felt safe. This call was no different, at least on the surface. Dispatch relayed the information. Mary had called in again, saying the children were back. They were laughing, hiding things, and making a mess. She was distressed, and it was my turn to respond. It was about 9 p.m. when I pulled up to Mary's house. The sky was already dark, and her home looked as foreboding as ever. It sat far off the main road, surrounded by a dense line of trees that seemed to close in around the property like an uninvited embrace. The house itself was a relic of a time long gone. Peeling paint, sagging porch, and windows that seemed too dark for a place someone still lived in. But Mary was inside, waiting for help, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked up the creaky front steps. She opened the door before I even knocked, her frail frame silhouetted in the dim light coming from inside. "Officer," she said, her voice shaky but filled with a certain urgency. "They're back, the children. They've been running around all evening." I nodded, doing my best to keep a calm, professional demeanor. "Let's take a look, Mary. Show me where you've seen them." She led me through her home. It smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of smell that clings to a place when it hasn't seen fresh air in far too long. The lights were dim, barely illuminating the small, cluttered rooms. As always, everything was just where it had been the last time I was here. An old rocking chair near the fireplace, shelves lined with knickknacks and fading photos, and a small dining table with mismatched chairs. We ended up in the dining room, where Mary pointed toward the far end of the house. "I saw them go in there, officer. They were laughing, running up the stairs." I shone my flashlight in the direction she pointed, the beam catching the worn wooden stairs that led up to the second floor. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but I knew the routine. I had to check. "I'll take a look upstairs, Mary," I said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Stay here, I'll be right back." I walked up the creaky stairs, taking each step slowly, listening for any signs of movement. The second floor was as silent as ever, just like the last time I'd been here. The rooms were small and mostly unused. An old guest room, a tiny bathroom, and Mary's bedroom. Everything was in order, nothing out of place. The windows were closed, no signs of anyone breaking in or sneaking around. I headed back downstairs to give Mary the usual report. "There's no one up there, Mary. The house is empty." She frowned, her eyes darting around the room. "But I saw them. They were just here. They're always here." I started to respond, the typical reassuring words on the tip of my tongue. But something in her expression stopped me. She looked genuinely scared, her eyes wide with an intensity I hadn't seen before. Then she pointed at something behind me. "You can't see him, can you? He's been staring at you this whole time." I froze. My skin prickled, a cold shiver running down my spine. I turned my head slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dim light in the dining room. I expected to see nothing, just like every other time. But there was something different about the air. a heaviness that pressed down on me. "There," she said again, louder this time. "Right there. He's grinning at you." I forced myself to turn fully and face the spot where she was pointing. There was nothing, of course, but the way she spoke, the sheer conviction in her voice, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Mary," I started, but she cut me off. "He's not a child," she whispered, almost too quietly for me to hear. "He's never been a child." The room seemed colder all of a sudden, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was indeed watching me. I scanned the room again, shining my flashlight in every corner, trying to rationalize the creeping fear that was building inside me. "I'm going to check the house one more time," I said, more to reassure myself than to comfort her. "Stay here." I walked through the rest of the house, checking every room again. It was the same as always, empty. But the strange feeling lingered, like a presence I couldn't quite explain. I finished my sweep and headed back to the dining room. When I got there, Mary was standing in the middle of the room staring at the same spot where she'd pointed before. Her lips were moving, but she wasn't saying anything out loud. It was like she was having a conversation with someone I couldn't see. I cleared my throat, trying to break the eerie silence. "Mary, there's no one here. You're safe." She didn't respond at first, just kept staring at the empty space. Then, without looking at me, she said, "He's waiting for you to leave. He doesn't like visitors." A chill ran through me, and I decided that was enough for one night. "I'm going to head out now," I told her. "Call us if you need anything." As I made my way toward the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that maybe this wasn't just a case of an old woman hallucinating. I walked outside, taking a deep breath of the cool night air, and closed the door behind me. I got back in my patrol car, radioed in that everything was clear, and drove away from Mary's house. But even as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The image of her pointing to that empty spot in the room, her voice filled with fear, kept replaying in my mind. As I pulled into the station later that night, I decided to talk to some of the other officers about it. I wasn't expecting much. Most of them would just laugh it off, say it was all in my head. But I needed to get it off my chest. When I mentioned Mary's house, though, the room went quiet. One of the older officers looked at me, his expression serious. "You saw him, didn't you?" I hesitated. "Saw who?" He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "We've all had calls to that house, and we've all seen something. Something we can't explain." I wanted to argue, to say it was just an old woman's delusions, but the look in his eyes told me he was dead serious. "Be careful out there," he said quietly. "Some things you see, you can't unsee." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and left the station. But even as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about Mary's house, about the way she'd looked at me that night. I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time I'd hear from her. Or from whatever, or whoever, was watching us from the shadows. The haunting call. I've been on the force for about 8 years, and in that time, I've seen a lot of strange things. You deal with a lot of chaos and unpredictability as a police officer, but some cases stick with you. This was one of them. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the kind that makes you think the rest of your shift will be uneventful. I was in my cruiser, parked near the old part of town, going through some paperwork when the call came in. "Burglary in progress. 1638 Evergreen Road. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio. Owner heard someone run upstairs. Unknown if suspect is still inside. Evergreen Road. A stretch of old, large houses that had been built back in the 1920s. Each one had its own character, but they were all known for their creaky wooden floors, winding staircases, and plenty of places for someone to hide. This particular house had been empty for years before the current owner moved in just a few months ago. I turned on my lights and headed toward the address. As I pulled up, I noticed the homeowner, a woman in her late 50s, pacing outside on the front lawn. She looked pale, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her phone. "I heard someone run upstairs," she said breathlessly as I stepped out of my cruiser. I was just in the kitchen. I heard the front door creak, then footsteps, fast, like someone was running up the stairs to the 3rd floor. I didn't see anyone, but I know what I heard. I nodded, trying to calm her down. "Stay here, ma'am. We're going to take a look." I called for backup and waited for my partner, Sarah, who was on her way with K9. While waiting, I took a walk around the perimeter of the house. The place was old, with peeling paint and ivy growing up one side. The windows on the 1st floor were all closed, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then again, nothing ever does in cases like this, until it does. Sarah arrived with Rex, our K9 unit, about 10 minutes later. We gave the dog a chance to sniff around the front yard, then briefed the other officers who had arrived to set up a perimeter around the house. If someone was inside, they weren't getting out without us knowing. I stepped toward the front door and called out, "This is the police. Come out with your hands up." Silence. I repeated the warning, but again, no response. Sarah and I exchanged a glance before we opened the door. Rex pulled against his leash, ready to go, but we had to be methodical. The house was eerily quiet as we entered. The old wooden floorboards creaked under our weight, and every sound seemed to echo through the halls. "I'll take the ground floor," Sarah said, moving off with Rex. "You check the 2nd and 3rd. I nodded and moved toward the staircase. As I climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the house felt too still, too cold. Or maybe it was just the atmosphere of an old house like this. When I reached the 2nd floor, everything seemed normal. There were 2 bedrooms, both empty, and a small bathroom. Nothing had been disturbed, and there was no sign of anyone hiding. Then came the 3rd floor. This part of the house was different. It was more like an attic than a proper 3rd floor, with low ceilings and exposed wooden beams. The light up here was dim, filtering through a single dusty window at the far end of the room. I stepped inside cautiously, my hand on my radio, ready to call for backup if needed. I did a quick sweep of the area. Nothing. No one was hiding in the shadows, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest anyone had been up here. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps, coming from above me. But that didn't make any sense. There wasn't an upstairs. The 3rd floor was the top of the house. I froze, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I listened closely, trying to pinpoint the sound. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps pacing back and forth. I pressed my radio. "Sarah, you hear that?" She responded immediately. "Hear what? I'm on the 1st floor. Everything's quiet down here." "I hear footsteps," I whispered, not wanting to raise my voice. "On the roof, maybe?" "Impossible." "You sure it's not just the house settling?" I didn't respond. I knew the difference between the creaks of an old house and the sound of someone moving. Just then, one of the perimeter officers radioed in. "I've got movement on the third-floor window. Looks like someone just pulled the curtain back." My heart skipped a beat. I looked toward the window at the far end of the attic. The curtain hung there, motionless, undisturbed. No sign of anyone. "I'm heading outside," I muttered into my radio, backing away. I needed a better look from the outside. When I got back to the front lawn, I scanned the house with the other officers. "You're sure you saw movement?" I asked the officer who had reported it. He nodded. Clear as day. A hand pulled the curtain back. I looked up at the third-floor window. From the ground, it seemed impossible to see much of anything in the dusty attic, but I trusted my colleague. If he saw movement, something or someone was up there. Sarah joined me, Rex still sniffing around the yard. "You want to send Rex in to sweep again?" she asked. "Yeah, let's do it," I agreed, still feeling the unease settling deeper in my chest. We had to get to the bottom of this. We re-entered the house, this time with Rex leading the way. He sniffed every corner of the first and second floors, but found nothing. When we reached the attic again, the dog hesitated, his ears perking up as we moved closer to the window where the officer had seen movement. Rex growled, low and deep. "Let him go," I whispered to Sarah. She released Rex, and the dog lunged forward, darting around the room. He sniffed near the window, his tail stiff, the hair along his back standing on end. He circled once, then twice, growling the whole time. But there was no one there. We did another sweep of the attic, checked every inch, but the place was empty. And yet, Rex refused to calm down. He stood near the window, barking at something we couldn't see. "I don't get it," Sarah muttered. "There's nothing here." We left the house after another fruitless search, still unsettled by what had happened. The homeowner was relieved we hadn't found a burglar, but still shaken by the sound she had heard. But I couldn't shake it. The footsteps, the officer's sighting, Rex's reaction. Something had been there, even if we couldn't explain it. For days after, I kept thinking about that call. The eerie silence of the house, the cold air on the third floor, the sense of being watched. We chalked it up to an overactive imagination, a house full of creaks and groans that could play tricks on you. But in my gut, I knew something wasn't right. A week later, the homeowner called the station again. She was moving out. Said she couldn't stay there any longer. Too many strange things had been happening since we'd left. Lights turning on and off by themselves. The sound of footsteps running up the stairs at odd hours, even when she was alone. I don't know what was in that house, but I do know this. It wasn't a burglar. It was something far worse. The phantom in the courthouse. Working as a deputy sheriff in the quiet town of Stony Brook, it was a job that usually had little excitement. Most days involved routine patrols, paperwork, and the occasional dispute between neighbors. But then there were those rare moments that left an impression so deep they were almost too surreal to believe. This story takes place during one of those moments, one that I still think about even after all these years. It was the summer of 1996, and I had been assigned to the old Stony Brook Courthouse, a building that had stood in the center of town for nearly a century. The courthouse had a rich history, having seen the trials of some of the region's most infamous criminals. But it wasn't just known for its history. The locals had their own tales about the courthouse, whispers about strange occurrences, voices that echoed through empty hallways, and the occasional sighting of figures who didn't belong. I never put much stock in ghost stories, especially ones tied to my workplace. Sure, the courthouse was old, and old buildings made strange noises, but I figured most of the stories were just that, stories. That was until the day I experienced something I couldn't explain. It was a particularly hot day, the kind that made the air inside the courthouse feel stifling despite the thick stone walls. I had been assigned to courtroom duty, ensuring everything ran smoothly during a high-profile trial. Stony Brook wasn't exactly known for its criminal activity, but every once in a while, a case would come through that stirred the town. This particular trial involved a man accused of embezzling a significant amount of money from a local charity, and the media had taken a keen interest in it. Court had just adjourned for a lunch break, and I found myself standing in the hallway outside the courtroom. The state's attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Keene, stood nearby, her arms crossed as she spoke with one of the clerks. A few reporters lingered as well, whispering among themselves about the case. As I leaned against the wall, trying to catch a brief moment of relaxation before the court resumed, my attention was drawn to the door of the jury room. It was a massive door, solid wood, with a brass handle that gleamed in the dim hallway light. I had seen it opened and closed dozens of times, and every time it took a bit of effort. It was the kind of door that didn't budge without a firm push. But this time, something strange happened. The jury room door, which had been securely closed just moments before, began to creak open. Slowly, almost as if someone were on the other side pulling it, the door swung open just wide enough for a person to walk through. I expected to see one of the jurors emerge, or maybe one of the clerks, but no one came out. The door just hung there, slightly ajar, as if waiting. I glanced over at Linda, who had stopped mid-sentence and was now staring at the door with a puzzled expression. The hallway fell silent, the chatter from the reporters fading as they too noticed the strange occurrence. Before I could step forward to investigate, the door, still hanging open, slammed shut with a force that echoed down the hallway. It wasn't just a gentle close. This was a violent, resounding slam that made the walls vibrate. I instinctively reached for the handle, half expecting to see someone on the other side. But when I tried to turn it, the door was locked. "Did you see that?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't easily rattled, but something about this felt wrong. There were no open windows in the hallway, no draft that could have caused the door to move, and even if there had been, it wouldn't have explained the way it slammed shut. It was as if someone, or something, had been on the other side, forcing it closed. I quickly radioed one of the other deputies, asking if anyone had been in the jury room. The response came back negative. The jurors were still on their lunch break, and no one had been inside since the trial had adjourned. With my hand still on the brass handle, I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. When I stepped inside, the room was empty. Chairs were neatly pushed in around the long table, and the windows were closed, the heavy curtains drawn to keep out the afternoon sun. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused the door to move the way it did. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a trick of the mind? A strange coincidence? But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. That door was heavy, and it didn't just open and close on its own. As I stepped back into the hallway, Linda gave me a look that said she was just as shaken as I was, though neither of us said anything more about it. The reporters had resumed their quiet conversations, but there was an unease in the air, as if everyone had felt the shift, even if they didn't fully understand it. Later that evening, As the courthouse emptied out and the sun dipped below the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had experienced something beyond explanation. I mentioned it to a few of the older deputies, and their responses were all the same. A knowing look, followed by a simple phrase. "Oh, you've seen it now." Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had encountered strange happenings in the old courthouse. Over the years, deputies, clerks, and even judges had reported similar occurrences. Doors opening and closing on their own, footsteps echoing down empty hallways, and the occasional shadowy figure glimpsed in the corner of the eye. It was as if the courthouse, with all its history and the weight of the trials it had witnessed, had developed a life of its own. I didn't talk about it much after that. It wasn't the kind of thing you brought up in casual conversation, especially in a job where you were expected to be level-headed and rational. But every time I walked past that jury room door, I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, a reminder that some things simply couldn't be explained. Even now, years later, I still think about that day in the courthouse. I still hear the slam of the door echoing in my mind, and I still feel the unsettling presence that seemed to linger in the air. And while I may never fully understand what happened, I know one thing for certain. The old courthouse in Stony Brook wasn't just a building. It was something more, something alive in its own way, with secrets and stories that went far beyond the cases tried within its walls. Noisy inmates. It was my third year working as a corrections officer at the Sandridge Detention Center, a facility tucked away in the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. This place had a reputation, not for overcrowding or violent inmates, but for something much stranger. You'd hear whispers among the staff, stories about the facility being haunted, weird occurrences happening late at night. I didn't buy into any of it. To me, it was just an old building with creaky floors and bad lighting. Ghost stories were for people with nothing better to do. That night, I was working the night shift. The facility was quieter than usual, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights echoing through the halls. Midnight had just passed, and I was doing my regular watch tour. It was my turn to check on the medical wing, which was always the eeriest part of the building. Unlike the general population areas, the medical wing was dimly lit and often empty. Most inmates didn't want to be there unless absolutely necessary. As I made my way down the narrow hall toward the medical wing, the sound of my boots on the tile echoed sharply. I reached the entrance, pushed the door open, and was greeted by the usual sterile smell of disinfectant and faint traces of something metallic. The wing had a few cells reserved for inmates who needed medical observation, just a few holding rooms with heavy steel doors and small hatches for peering inside. I turned a corner and froze. I heard voices. They were faint, just barely audible, like two people talking quietly. It wasn't unusual for inmates to talk to each other through the walls, but the medical wing was mostly empty. My gut told me to keep moving, but curiosity got the better of me. I continued down the hallway, following the sound of the conversation. The voices were clearer now. Two distinct tones, one low and gruff, the other lighter, almost conversational. I approached the first cell. There was no name on the door, which meant it was supposed to be vacant. Still, the talking continued. I leaned in close, listening. The conversation was muffled, but I could hear bits and pieces of what sounded like an argument. I wasn't sure what they were fighting over, but it sounded tense. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and unlocked the small hatch on the door to peer inside. As soon as I opened it, the voices stopped. Dead silence. I flicked on my flashlight and looked into the cell. Nothing. The room was completely empty, just a neatly made bed and a few standard issue blankets. I frowned, my skin crawling. I was sure I had heard something. I stepped back from the door and glanced down the hallway. The second cell was occupied. There was a name scrawled on a small plate affixed to the door, C. Matthews. I remembered this guy, Clarence Matthews, in for drug possession and assault. A troublemaker, but nothing out of the ordinary. His cell was right next to the one that I'd heard the voices from. I figured it might have been Matthews talking to someone, so I went over to his cell and unlocked the hatch. I looked inside. Matthews was lying on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, hands behind his head, as if he hadn't a care in the world. I almost closed the hatch without saying anything, but something stopped me. Before I could move, Matthews shifted his gaze toward me, his eyes dull but sharp in a way that made me uneasy. "You mind moving my neighbours?" he asked casually, his voice steady, as if he'd just asked for a glass of water. "They've been keeping me up all night, you know, a lot of talking going on in here." I froze, the words hanging in the air for a moment. I hadn't told him what I had heard, or rather, hadn't heard. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice calm. "What neighbours?" I asked, feeling a tightness in my chest. "The cell next to you is empty." Matthews raised an eyebrow and sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "What are you talking about, officer? They've been in there all night, arguing, yelling. I could barely sleep." I blinked, glancing back at the first cell. The one I had just checked, the one that was completely empty. A chill crept up my spine. "I'll check again," I muttered, more to reassure myself than to inform him. I moved back to the first cell, feeling the weight of Matthew's gaze on my back. My hand shook slightly as I unlatched the door and swung it open, flicking on the overhead light this time. The cell was as empty as before. Nothing but concrete walls and steel bars. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, trying to make sense of it. But it wasn't just the emptiness that unnerved me. It was the feeling that someone, was watching me. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I slammed the door shut and quickly locked it, my heart hammering in my chest. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, the low, guttural sound of someone talking. But this time, it wasn't coming from Matthew's cell. It was coming from the first one, the empty one. I froze, my hand hovering over the radio clipped to my belt. I considered calling it in, getting backup. But what would I say? That I'd heard voices in an empty room? That I was scared of a cell with no one inside? My colleagues would think I was losing it. Instead, I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk back toward Matthew's cell. He was still sitting on the edge of his bed, watching me with that same unnerving expression. "You hear it, don't you?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You hear them now?" I didn't respond. I just stared at him, my mind racing. I couldn't deny it anymore. I had heard something. And Matthews, for all his troublemaking and bravado, looked genuinely spooked. I stepped closer to his cell, lowering my voice. "Who are they?" I asked, my throat dry. "The voices. Who do you think they are?" Matthews shook his head slowly, his eyes dark and haunted. "I don't know," he whispered. "But they've been here a long time. Longer than me. Longer than any of us." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the building settling. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe Matthews was playing some sort of mind game with me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I finished my rounds as quickly as I could, my nerves on edge the entire time. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, and I didn't hear the voices again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. The next day, I asked some of the other officers if they'd ever experienced anything strange in the medical wing. Most of them shrugged it off, saying they hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. But a few of the older officers, the ones who had been around longer, exchanged uneasy glances. "That wing's always been weird," one of them said, a veteran named Harris. "It's not just the inmates who say they hear things. A lot of us have heard voices in there late at night. Some say it's the old place, just playing tricks on us. Others, well, they say it's something else. Something that's been here since before this place was built." I didn't ask any more questions after that. I didn't want to know. But every time I worked the night shift, especially when I had to patrol the medical wing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was still there, watching. Midnight shift. It was a Tuesday night, and I was pulling a graveyard shift in the old district substation on the edge of Briarwood. Everyone knew the place was past its prime. It had been standing there for decades, built back when Briarwood was nothing more than a sleepy little town. The city had since grown around it, but the substation remained, old and creaky, with rumours of demolition circulating every few years. Most nights, especially during these late shifts, the place was quiet, dead quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you more aware of the building's age, the way the floorboards creaked when you walked down the hall, or how the pipes groaned with the weight of time. I had worked at the Briarwood sub for about 4 years by then, and though I wasn't crazy about the old place, it had a certain charm. The history, the stories, though most of those stories were ones I preferred not to dwell on. Tales about weird things that officers had seen or heard late at night, strange noises or sightings, were just the kind of gossip that circled in places like this. I wasn't one to believe in the paranormal. I was practical, a cop after all. We dealt in facts, evidence, things you could see and touch. Ghosts didn't fit into that category. That night was like any other graveyard shift. The city was quiet, and most of my colleagues were out on patrol. I decided to stay back and finish up some reports. The desk was cluttered, the light dim, but I didn't mind the solitude. It was rare to have any real downtime during a shift. Around 2:30 a.m., I decided to take my lunch break. I grabbed my sandwich and sat back in my chair, stretching out a little. The hallway lights were on, illuminating the dim room enough that I didn't need to turn on my office lamp. I preferred it that way. The glow from the hallway made everything seem a little less lonely. I was halfway through my sandwich when I heard the door at the far end of the hall open. The sound was unmistakable. The heavy metal click as the latch gave way, followed by the familiar creak of the hinges. I froze, mid-bite, listening intently. No one else was supposed to be in the substation. I knew that. The rest of the squad was out on patrol and I hadn't heard anyone come in. But then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking down the hall toward me. I put my sandwich down, suddenly on edge. Maybe one of the officers had come back early, though they hadn't radioed in. Still, it was odd that they'd sneak in without saying anything. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart began to pound, but I kept my cool. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the doorway of my office. The hall light illuminated the entryway, casting a soft glow into the room. And then I saw it. A shadow. A figure. standing right there in the doorway. At first, I thought it was one of the officers, maybe Andrew or Martinez playing a prank on me. But this figure, it was different. It was tall, looming, and completely still. The darkness of its form stood in sharp contrast to the light of the hallway. It wasn't just a shadow cast by something else. It was solid, or at least it looked solid. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something was off. This wasn't just a person standing there. The figure had no features, no face, no clothing, just a dark, human-like outline standing in the doorway, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. For a few seconds, it didn't move. It just stood there. My pulse raced, and I found myself instinctively reaching for my sidearm, though I didn't draw it. I didn't want to move, didn't want to break whatever fragile balance had settled in the room. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked down the hall toward the lieutenant's office. The footsteps resumed, echoing faintly as it disappeared from sight. For a moment, I sat there, unable to process what had just happened. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the flicker of the hallway light had played tricks on my eyes. But no, I hadn't imagined those footsteps. They were real. I had heard them as clearly as I was hearing the sound of my own breath now. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. My eyes darted to the clock on the wall. It was just after 3 a.m. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hallway, my heart still thudding in my chest. The place was empty, completely still. I walked down the hall, checking each door as I went. Nothing. When I reached the lieutenant's office, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, the way it had been left earlier. I nudged it open with the toe of my boot, shining my flashlight inside. The room was empty, just as it should have been. I checked the windows, the closets, every corner of that small space, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was just the late hour messing with my head. But the sound of those footsteps, the image of that shadowy figure standing in my doorway, it was too real to be a hallucination. I locked up the lieutenant's office and made my way back to my desk, shaken but trying to convince myself it was nothing. As I sat down, my radio crackled to life. "Hey, Olivia?" Martinez's voice came through, crackling with static. "You okay? You sound off." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a laugh. "Just tired, I guess." "You still at the substation?" "Yeah, finishing up reports." There was a pause on the other end before Martinez spoke again, his tone more serious. "You ever see anything weird in that place?" My heart skipped a beat. "Why do you ask?" Martinez hesitated, and I could hear the unease in his voice when he finally spoke. "Just the other guys talk about strange things happening there. You know, like seeing things that shouldn't be there." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of my desk. "What kind of things?" "Shadows," he said quietly. "Footsteps, doors opening and closing. One of the guys swears he saw a figure standing in the hallway once, right near your office." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I didn't believe it at first," Martinez continued. "But after working here a while, I've seen a few things myself. It's why I don't like coming back to the substation until the sun's up." I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Was I just another in a long line of officers who had experienced something strange here? Or was there something else going on in this old building? Something none of us could explain? I didn't tell Martinez what had happened to me that night. Instead, I finished my reports, packed up, and left the substation as soon as the morning sun began to rise over Briarwood. I never spoke about it again. Not to my colleagues, not even to myself. I couldn't make sense of it, and I didn't want to. But every time I passed by that old substation, I'd feel a shiver run down my spine, and I'd remember the shadow figure that had stood in my doorway, as real as anything else I'd ever seen. Some things, it seemed, were better left unspoken. Escape from the haunted warehouse. It was just past midnight when my partner, Officer Raina Torres, and I were patrolling the quiet streets of Glenshire, a small town that clung to its Victorian roots like ivy on an old mansion. Glenshire wasn't exactly known for excitement. Most nights were filled with mundane calls, teenagers causing mischief, a few drunken arguments, and the occasional noise complaint. But that night would be different, a night I'll never forget no matter how hard I try. We were patrolling the Old Mill District, an area that had once been the beating heart of Glenshire's economy. Now, it was mostly a graveyard of crumbling warehouses and abandoned factories, long past their prime. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of rusting metal or the scurry of a rat through the alleyways. The district had its fair share of ghost stories, tales told by the older officers in the precinct. Stories of strange figures, shadows that moved on their own, and phantom footsteps. But I'd always chalked it up to overactive imaginations. Until that night. It was around 1:30 a.m. when the call came in. A frantic security guard had flagged down a passerby, claiming he'd seen something inside one of the warehouses. Normally, we wouldn't bother with such calls, but the guard was in such a state of panic that dispatch sent us to check it out. As we rolled down the dimly lit streets, we saw him. A man in his late 40s, wearing a crumpled security uniform, standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms like a madman. His face was pale, and sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool night air. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost, and as it turned out, that's exactly what he claimed. Raina pulled the cruiser to a stop just in time to avoid hitting him. He staggered toward my window, his breath coming in gasps. "Help me!" he cried, his voice trembling. "You've got to help me!" I stepped out of the car, trying to calm him down. "Take it easy, man. What happened?" He pointed across the street to a decrepit warehouse, its rusted tin roof gleaming faintly under the moonlight. "In there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was doing my rounds when I saw her. "Saw who?" I asked, my heart already starting to race. "The old woman," he stammered. "She was floating in the air, 2 feet off the ground. She had this wild dark hair, and her eyes were glowing red like coals. She pointed at me and said she'd drag me to hell if I didn't leave." Raina shot me a skeptical look. "Ghost? You sure you didn't just see a shadow or something?" But the man shook his head vehemently. No, I know what I saw. I'm telling you, she wasn't human." I exchanged a glance with Raina, who rolled her eyes. "Sounds like he's had a rough night," she muttered under her breath. "You think he's high on something?" But there was something in the guard's eyes that made me hesitate. Sheer, unadulterated terror. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't deny that he was genuinely scared out of his mind. "Okay," I said, turning back to the guard. "What's your supervisor's number? Let's see if he knows anything about this." The guard fumbled for his phone and gave me the number. I called his supervisor, who sounded annoyed but agreed to meet us at the warehouse. We waited in the eerie quiet for about 10 minutes before a beat-up pickup truck pulled up. A tall man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard climbed out and walked over to us. He introduced himself as Greg, the head of the security company. I explained the situation to him, expecting him to laugh it off. But instead, Greg's face grew serious. "This isn't the first time," he said, glancing nervously at the warehouse. "We've sent 7 different guards to work this post. All 7 of them have seen something. 4 of them requested transfers, and the other 3 quit. None of them ever wanted to talk about what they saw, but I've heard enough to know that they all saw the same thing, a woman floating in the air, threatening them." Raina raised an eyebrow. "And you never thought to tell anyone about this before?" Greg shrugged, his expression grim. "Who would believe me? People would think I'm crazy. Hell, even I thought it was just some shared hallucination or something. Until now." I looked over at Raina. "Well," I said, my voice steady, "I think we need to take a look inside." Raina shot me a look that said, "Are you insane?" But she nodded, and we both retrieved our flashlights from the car. The warehouse loomed in front of us like a forgotten tomb, its windows dark and broken. The guard refused to come with us, staying behind with Greg, who didn't look much more eager to follow. Raina and I crossed the street and made our way to the entrance. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the scent of rot hanging heavy in the darkness. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing rows of rusted machinery and stacks of forgotten crates. The warehouse had clearly been abandoned for years, but it didn't feel empty. In fact, it felt like we were being watched. "Creepy place," Raina muttered, her voice echoing off the metal walls. We moved deeper into the warehouse, our footsteps crunching on the broken glass and debris that littered the floor. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow stretched and distorted by the beam of our flashlights. Then suddenly, we heard it. A low, shuffling sound from somewhere up ahead. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the handle of my gun. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Raina nodded, her expression tense. We both turned our flashlights toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. Just an empty stretch of concrete floor. "Maybe it was a rat," Raina said, though she didn't sound convinced. We continued forward, our footsteps slow and deliberate. The deeper we went, the colder the air became, as if we were walking into some kind of freezer. My breath came out in visible puffs, and a chill ran down my spine. And then we saw it. At the far end of the warehouse, just beyond the reach of our flashlights, a figure stood. It was an old woman, her long dark hair floating around her head as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. Her eyes glowed red in the darkness, and her thin, bony finger was pointed directly at us. "I told you!" she hissed, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. "You going to hell!" My blood ran cold. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Raina grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Let's get out of here," she whispered urgently. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned and bolted for the door, our footsteps echoing like gunshots in the empty warehouse. Behind us, I could hear the woman's voice, laughing, a low, guttural sound that seemed to follow us out into the night. When we finally burst through the door and into the street, Greg and the security guard were standing there, their eyes wide with fear. "Did you see her?" the guard asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, unable to find the words. We never went back to that warehouse. Greg shut the place down, claiming structural concerns as the reason. But the truth was, no one in Glenshaw wanted to go near it anymore. Not after what we saw. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. I don't believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't. But after that night, I'm not so sure. You made it through the darkness. Bloody subscribe for more chills and have a hauntingly good night.